Hey, welcome, or maybe I should say welcome back in our AZ-801 course, where it's still all about configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. My name is Peter Detender, and I'll be your trainer for this module. In this specific module, we're gonna tackle the complexity, I would say, of monitoring and troubleshooting your Windows Server environment. And if you've been here since the first module, you already know how we do this. One module covers the specifics around Windows Server, and the follow-up module covers about the same topic, monitoring troubleshooting, but then looking at it from an Azure workload perspective. So in this module, it's all about how to use the built-in Windows Server monitoring capabilities to know what's going on in your environment, and maybe using some of that, obviously, during a troubleshooting time as well. So I got 4 short sections to cover. The first one is monitoring your server performance, and I would say overall your server behavior, because there could be a lot more going on with your server that you need to look into apart from performance. Next to that, touching a bit on the built-in Windows Server capabilities, like what are the tools that we use for monitoring, where we're going to touch on event logging, followed by specific Windows Server auditing diagnostics, and that's where you could see that it might go a little bit more into that troubleshooting mindset, and then also highlighting a few tips and tricks if something goes wrong in your Active Directory running environment, just sharing a few ideas where you could start troubleshooting. Now, I gotta say personally, the whole topic about monitoring is quite tricky. Why? Because there's so many different ways how you could monitor. There's a lot of different reasons why you should look into monitoring, and it's not really possible to capture all those scenarios. So if you go like, hey, this looks kind of limited, aren't there other ways to monitor my environment? Then I gotta say, obviously, yes. Next to that, we also know out of like just the fact that customers have hybrid scenarios, which means Windows Server, but then also maybe Linux machines, Unix machines, other kinds of devices, that you might not always rely on the built-in Windows Server capabilities that you have for monitoring and troubleshooting. Now, obviously, if you're here for the exam, I would say make sure that you get really familiar with the different tools we're highlighting. And with that, I'm going to loop through the different topics for this first section. So we're going to talk about Performance Monitor, one of the easy tools, I would say, in any version of Windows Server. Even a long time ago when Peter started his career in NT4 Server, I would say Performance Monitor was already there. Next, we're going to talk a bit about Resource Monitor, which, as you could guess, is going to look into broader resource management than just the performance characteristics. Next to that, we also have Reliability Monitor, and that's going to allow you to look at your uptime of your running Windows Server workloads. Next to that, we're going to bring in the data collector sets, and what we're going to do with data collector sets is actually not just having that spot on the moment of you looking into Performance Monitor, Resource Monitor, like I want to get a view on what's happening with my server like right now, or maybe over the last couple of hours, but you can use data collector sets to actually capture information for or over a longer period of time, and then using that to analyze, like, is my performance increasing, is it decreasing, and then obviously how you can deal with all that. So pretty exciting topic, because I think monitoring is probably something that we all have to do as server admins. So a couple of screenshots here just to quickly set the scene. So the starting point is if you have a feeling, or maybe a user complaining about the application performance, like it's not moving, it's not fast enough, I would say one of that immediate triggers is let's open up Performance Monitor and try to find the root cause of the problem. Performance is only one of the so many aspects, so you can look into different counters. I'll show you that in a demo. There's like quite a lot of them. And that's again where I'm just gonna pick out a few easy examples that allows me to easily show you what it looks like. But in your environment, based on the characteristics of the server, the network, maybe the application running on top, it could become a lot more complex. Next to performance issues, you could have other challenges, or you just want to get a view on the runtime of your environment. The funny thing, for me at least, with monitoring is that as long as everything runs fine, you're probably typically not going to use it. So it's almost that you're going to look into monitoring only when something goes wrong. And I could, warn you that maybe you should have that overall monitoring state and not just when something goes wrong. But it's just what we do, right? When everything runs fine, no complaints, why would we look into trying and fix something? And that's where this one could actually be useful, where we talked about performance, but there's a lot more going on your Windows server. And that's where you could stretch the topology a little bit and opening up Resource Monitor, where it's going to show you not only performance, but also highlights about CPU load, disk, network, and even memory, where you can see all running processes and a little bit interacting with Task Manager, you could actually stop processes from here as well. Another interesting one is Reliability Monitor. So in the end, as an admin, you're interested in keeping your servers running as good as healthy as possible. But every now and then, I guess, we also know that sometimes it's not always 100% reliable. That's where you could now open up Reliability Monitor, and it's going to show you as part of the platform. You don't need to install it per se. It's already part of the operating system, but it's going to look into security. It's going to look into overall maintenance and just highlighting like, hey, I detected some problems with maybe devices, maybe virtual devices, or even problems with specific application or system workloads running on that server. So pretty convenient, pretty easy. And as you can see already in the screenshot, it's giving you that like one single view dashboard and highlighting what's going wrong, or even better, what's not going wrong with your environment. Now, overall, this is just like a little recap, like some guidelines you could say. How do we get started? So again, first of all, the mindset is we don't need to monitor, we don't need to look into our environment as long as everything's running fine. But I would like to argue that you should look into your environment all the time. You cannot manage, you cannot admin if you're not monitoring. That's Peter's take on it. Why? Because you could also look into a data analysis. It's not that a server is running crazy today, CPU loads, memory loads, maybe CPU spikes. But if you don't have that trend analysis, like what is the average or the normal server behavior, if you never looked into it before now that problem popping up, it means you don't have anything to compare with. So that's where recommendation one here is, make sure that you monitor everything and you monitor always. And then from there, building that baseline and creating a trend analysis. Next to that, it also is going to help you with capacity planning. I remember so many scenarios at customers in the past when I was still in consulting and not the full-time trainer, where customers reach out like, hey, Peter, we have a problem. My workloads are not there. My server crashed. And it's just because like disk storage was running out of capacity, or literally even helping in some sort of a pre-sale cycle in a migration. Like, hey, we have this infrastructure. We've been running it for a couple of years. And now we want to, or we need to move to a new data center, new servers, whether it's physical or virtual, didn't really matter. And you're going to ask them like, okay, what's your forecast of storage growth in the next 3 to 5 years? And they go like, I don't know. Don't we have a monitoring tool to help us with that? So that's exactly where this could come in. Next to that, back to that analysis and the assessment part, understanding bottlenecks. Again, if your server is acting weird today, it's doing crazy today, but you have nothing to map it with, like maybe it's normal behavior. And that's where, again, that monitoring over a longer period of time could be beneficial. And then last, not all problems are related to the exact workload, like running inside a virtual machine. So forget about being too focused on looking into the virtual machine, only looking into a specific application workload, because on the end, it's all running on physical hardware. So you might have, CPU loads, maybe network latency, not because of the virtual machines, but maybe because of something going wrong on the hardware level. And that was like at that point, number 4 here. Now we talked about the importance of like doing that trend analysis. And if you wonder how you could do that from within a Windows Server platform, that's where data collector sets are coming in. It's going to allow you to capture specific performance counters out of Performance Monitor that we talked about, and just capturing that information over a longer period of time. From there, it's obviously going to allow you to not only capture, but also allowing you to really run that analysis, just comparing, maybe creating some sort of a benchmark. And you could do this manual, but you could also schedule it. So that's, I would say, the first part here, where the main topic is use Performance Monitor, become familiar with it, check out Resource Monitor, and use Reliability Monitor to just get a pretty clear view. What is that overall high availability or reliability of my running Windows Server environment? Single server, multi-server, that's all part of the setup. And as you can see here, instead of just talking about it, I'm going to jump to my demo server and I'm going to show you some things in my demo environment. So let's have a look at a couple of, I would say, built-in Windows Server monitoring tools, where the starting view here is Performance Monitor. Within just a split second, you can see here like what's going on with my server. It's going to show you like memory state, network traffic, information, disk read-write operations, and overall processor time. From that high-level view, you would probably dive into Performance Monitor, and it's going to show you this real-time view. This is like a live running server. And obviously, it's going to use like one basic performance counter option. And now the goal is to add more of them. So you're going to select the plus sign. And obviously, depending on your server, it's going to show you a lot more of these, because it's not only reading out the operating system, but sometimes it can also read out application performance counters. Let's do SMB shares checking like netlogon. We're going to add it in here. And as you can see, it's now adding specific information to our chart here. You can select any of these, and then depending obviously on the values, it might show up in the chart or not, because this is a little bit off topic. But what you can do is highlighting specific scenarios. You can remove them. You can change like the layout. So a couple of easy options. You can create a data collector set, and this is the demo set, where you're going to define a collection of parameters. And it's also allowing you to create some sort of a trend analysis. So the first part means I'm going to look into the actual metric information, what's happening on the server right now. And then with the data collector set, you're going to create your own ones. So there's a few pre-built ones, and it's going to show you the tracing in this case, because it's a Azure virtual machine. It has some specific tracing information. But you could also drill down on, for example, like Active Directory diagnostics, what's going on with my server from an Active Directory perspective, and then reading out some specific information. So that's, in short, what Performance Monitor is doing. Second one we talked about is Resource Monitor. So this is Resource Monitor, actually another pretty intuitive to use tool in the Windows Server platform, and it has been around for quite some years already, where it's going to show you different tabs like CPU load, memory state, disk, and you can also see the actual running processes, like who's using disk interaction. You can zoom in on disk activity. You can look into, let me make this a bit bigger, into specific storage, so my local C drive performance. And here on the side, it's going to show you some chart views of that as well. You can stop the monitoring, which I don't really know why you should do that, but maybe you want to just get that like on the spot view. And then you could also save the settings. Like if you want to customize the look and feel, you could also save that. Last one is reliability, where in my demo VM, there's not too much going wrong, I would say, because it's not running long enough. But as you can see here in just a split view, it's going to show you like this is your runtime. Obviously, I don't have history over the last couple of days because my VM was only running for a couple of minutes. But it's going to highlight like, well, here you do have an application failure. You might have a Windows problem, so that's easy to find out. You select the critical events, And it's going to show you like, well, in this case, admin center stopped working, just to have some data simulated here, what it's going to come back with. And then also identifying some informationals like updating something out of Windows updates that we talked about in another module. So that 3 easy built-in tools: performance monitor, resource monitor, and reliability monitor. So let's move on with the presentation because there's a little bit more I want to talk about. Now we talked about monitoring the overall performance, the reliability, and brought in another demo, but it's not the only option you have. Like, oh, this is my Windows server, this is what I need to monitor. Now, obviously, this is a little bit more specific on the network side. If you think about a Windows Server environment, you probably, but not always, because we know that a lot of organizations, like maybe yours, is not using those built-in Windows Server capabilities, but using third-party appliances to do that. But overall, even if it's not on Windows, I would say the overall monitoring or the importance of monitoring is still valid. We want to highlight monitoring DNS, monitoring DHCP. What it means is within the Windows Server platform, if you're running them as DNS servers or DHCP servers, you're going to use all possible tools to validate if those services are running healthy. And again, not only when something goes wrong, but again, trying to find that baseline. As long as everything is running healthy, just quickly look into it. If there's no problems, nothing showing up in Event Viewer, then you know that everything is running as expected. Another example we want to highlight here is monitoring your virtual machines. So obviously the assumption here is that you're going to run Windows Server as your hypervisor, similar to VMware, but not running on VMware, pretty obvious. And it means that you also need to monitor your Hyper-V baseline. There's a lot of different similarities. You could use performance monitor, reliability monitor, not just for the virtual machine, but also for the underlying hypervisor. And then here, what we're doing is also allowing you to run a few additional, what we call Hyper-V resource metering parameters. Using PowerShell, you're going to enable it. You can disable the metering. You can reset it. And then from there, using the measure VM, and again, creating some sort of a baseline. I got a screenshot of this. And then from there, you could also move everything that I talked about up till now into that Windows Admin Center. Again, it's just an option. We used Windows Admin Center for a lot of different scenarios throughout the course. So no surprise that a lot of the monitoring, the performance, the reliability is now also brought into Admin Center. On top of that, one of the other things that we do have in Admin Center is what we call System Insights. It's basically bringing a lot of the monitoring information in one single dashboard view. And then last, there's another side path here on. Now we did our monitoring. We know what's going on and maybe going wrong with the server. How can we fix it? Now there's again a lot of variations here. Now in short, check out your server hardware. Again, we're talking and assuming it's Hyper-V. If you're running way too many virtual machines and your server, the physical server, cannot keep up, well, maybe it's time to tune the hardware and maybe migrate to a new Hyper-V platform. Within Hyper-V itself, you could also look into the file systems. You could look into managing the Hyper-V service. You could look into like maybe running your Windows server as a container host instead of running like maybe oversized virtual machines, using some application migration approach and not running everything in a virtual machine anymore. And then within the server subsystem, the last point here, try to look into caching, looking into memory, like memory leaks, CPU leaks out of the application. Maybe talk to the developers if you have in-house applications where you think they're not always running as healthy as they should. Check out the network stack and then obviously also check out the underlying storage. Now to help you with all that, I got yet another demo coming up where I'm going to go back to my demo Hyper-V environment, showing you a bit what that Hyper-V host monitoring from the PowerShell console looks like, and then doing some monitoring capabilities out of Windows Admin Center and primarily highlighting System Insights. So let's have a look at the Windows Admin Center, which has a lot of, I would say, really cool features. But for now, let's zoom in on some of the monitoring capabilities. So the starting point is obviously deploying Windows Admin Center. And from there, it allows you to or create a gateway like one central server, like maybe some sort of a management station, or deploying it on each and every server. Now, the monitoring piece, as you can see, you start with the overview section. This is my domain controller, and I can already manage my server using some interaction options here. Disk metric view, that's monitoring, but I can also restart, I can shut down the server, so pretty easy to use. When we zoom in on monitoring characteristics, there is a built-in monitoring dashboard where right now it's reading out over here CPU, Ethernet network, there's memory, and it also gives you a view on alerts. So pretty similar to what I mentioned in the standalone performance monitor or reliability. You could basically read all that information from here. Like it's generating a view of alerts, and interesting enough, in this case, it's an application error from Admin Center, but it's just because my servers are not running long enough, or I'm just shutting them down. And that's where every now and then it's not doing a proper shutdown and generating the error messages. But it's pretty easy to use. Next to that, I like the fact that it's all in the browser and it just looks nice. That's, I would say, another benefit. Now, other options you have here is interacting with Azure. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the hybrid module after this one, but it's pretty easy, pretty intuitive, like integrating or interacting with like Azure Monitor. And that's really the beauty of this solution, where it's going to allow you to interact in a lot of different scenarios. So if I move down, obviously this machine is not in Azure, so that's why it's not really working. But you could also look into like scheduled tasks, roles and features, like instead of going to the server manager, you could already manage your server from here. You can look into scheduled tasks. I don't have them, so gonna skip it. I got my services up and running. And then from here, once you select the service, you can stop them, pause them, and you could also do the same from shortcut menus. Last little item is System Insights. So this is a pre-built component where it's gonna trace information about, like in this case, CPU, network, storage, and overall volume consumption. And then you can select one and it's going to give you more insights. A little bit like the, I would say, data collector that I talked about in the performance monitor, but now all this from easy manageable, easy accessible browser interface. You can honestly do a lot more. You can run PowerShell from here. So PowerShell in the browser, pretty cool, where you don't have to run it from within the server itself. Looking up actual events, like instead of using event viewer, it's now going to pull up the recent events. And again, it's just an easy, nice to manage interface. So that's in short what Windows Admin Center could mean for you as a replacement for the traditional monitoring capabilities on a Windows server. Good. So all that worked, but we're not done yet with monitoring because Windows Server has another few monitoring tools baked in, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Obviously, if you've been managing Windows Server, you already guessed what I was going to talk about next, and that's Windows Server Event Viewer or Event Logging. So for the ones who are pretty new to the Windows Server operating system, almost anything that's going on in your server, apart from the performance statistics, reliability statistics, the Hyper-V host, monitoring capabilities, every Windows server and client has event viewing and event logging as part of the operating system. And again, every now and then, I like to go back to my starting point as a technical engineer. So even in NT4 server 30 years ago, we already had event viewer. I even remember like offering my customers a service where I would do like weekly or sometimes monthly health checks. And one of the big tasks was literally going through all those event logs and identifying if we needed to make some changes to the system, maybe capturing some security issues, capturing performance issues, and all that out of event logging. And that's, I would say, mainly the message I want to share out of this section. talking a bit what is Event Viewer, why should we use it, going back to Windows Admin Center, where again a lot of that information is getting centralized, and just walking you through a little bit what it could look like to use it on, again, maybe a day-to-day basis, and not only going back to it when something goes wrong with your server for the troubleshooting aspect of it. Now, the starting point is opening up Event Viewer. I got a demo coming up, so if you've never used it before, nothing to worry about. So in short, Event Viewer is going to give you a lot of logging-based insights, so it's not like CPU statistics or performance counters like I showed you before. It's literally providing a detailed description of an actual event that's happening on the server. It's going to give you informational, like everything's fine, nothing to worry about, and it's detecting warnings and error messages as well. So depending a bit on what you want to get out of it, you're going to filter and looking for system logging, application logging, or security logging. Those are the three prime services that we have. So application logging, I guess, is pretty obvious. If you run anything on top of your Windows platform, like an Exchange server, SQL server, any kind of other application that you might run, it's probably going to send some event information into event logging. You're going to look into it from an admin perspective, operational, where there's a fine difference there. In the end, you're going to loop through and trying to find out like, hey, what's going on with my server? And again, once more, I could share the recommendation to not only look into it when everything is going wrong, but already looking into it before something goes wrong. Because a lot of the information that you see in an event viewer could actually help you thinking about an upcoming problem before the problem occurs. So that's another use case there. Now we got Event Viewer as a standalone little tool in the Windows platform, but you could imagine that we like to centralize things in Admin Center as well. Again, giving you that easy view, like the total view even, on what the runtime of your server looks like, not just for troubleshooting, because we talked about this for like Azure Backup integration and all the way into performance counters and everything else we already talked about and showed you in Admin Center. So got, again, quite some screenshots here. Same for overall server management. So if you're installing services like Windows features and roles, a lot of that information about the installation, about the runtime, it's also showing up in the event logging. Apart from all this, you could literally open it up, filtering based on the date, based on the event type, and you could also create your custom views. So just creating your own basic filtering, because maybe, although it's important to capture, but you could maybe create like a specific filter, like a custom view, where it's not reporting back everything, but it also means that the custom view is just a filter. So it's not removing or ignoring all the other events. All that information is still there. You just don't want to get access to all that information in the view as part of your troubleshooting task. That could be the main scenario. And then from there, you could also define subscriptions, which means that you're going to enable them and you can configure forwarding, like maybe instead of you hopping around from one server to the other, you could now centralize all that logging information into a centralized server. And again, if you use third-party products on top of Windows Server platform, or maybe across all your devices, Windows, Linux appliances, then you could also like offload some of your event logging into that monitoring capability. So you could imagine after flipping a few screenshots, right, I'm going to show you a little bit what it could look like managing your servers using Event Viewer specifically out of Event Viewer itself, and then switching to the Admin Center look and feel experience as well. So for this next demo, I think I'm touching on one of the easier, maybe more common scenarios for anyone like yourself who's a Windows Server admin, and that's using Event Viewer. So by design, you have this on the Windows platform, and it's split up in two sections. One is Windows logs, where you can look into application logs, security logs, and system logs. And then if you need more details for specific applications, I would say a little bit outside of the core operating system, you're probably going to look into the application and services section. The way it works is kind of straightforward. So if you look into, let me make this a little bit bigger. If you look into the system view, it's typically touching on anything that's related to the operating system level, maybe the physical layer, sometimes a bit on the virtual machine layer, and each and every of the actions inside your server are typically, I would say, logged into the event viewer. You got the informations, warnings, and errors, and then the logic is that for each and every of the highlights, it's going to give you more details and then showing you even more details about what is the host, what is the event ID. I remember like years ago where I would do health checks on servers, as I mentioned in the presentation. And a big part of what a health check was about was really screening the event logging information from the server and trying to find the root cause and then maybe coming up with a solution a couple of days or weeks after. So pretty intuitive. You can obviously move around if you want to look into application specifics. It's going to again show you details. Let's highlight over here, desktop, register to port, and then an error message over here, where now the idea would be to maybe look into recurring error messages, like in this case here, a little bit more below. I got a sequence of errors related to the same application, and then maybe doing some troubleshooting. So that's what the use case would look like. Once we drill down on more specific information about applications, you would look into the application and services logs. So like in this case, it's a domain controller. Domain controller typically runs DNS. So that's where you're going to see the exact same information in application or system, but now coming into a DNS section. Or even more down, like on the Microsoft platform, Windows, you can see that down here, it's having a lot of more detailed sections. So just looking around, I would say, and then here on the other side, we can filter. So if you don't want to see all information, but you want to filter based on only seeing warnings and maybe criticals, you can immediately see the impact of that. And then always try to move back. That's what I had. Sometimes you forget about like, hey, there's not a lot of information. Like, whoops, I had some filters in there. You can export, you can clear the logs, you can save them into like an event viewer format. And that means that now you could move it over into like a management station. You can also do remote event monitoring. So up here, by design, when you open it up, it's the local machine, but you could also connect to other computers, obviously assuming that you do have the correct credentials and remote management to do that. There's so much more in Event Viewer, but again, my take is that you probably are already familiar with it. Now, the other nice thing is that you have similar scenarios available in Windows Admin Center. Out of the local server, or obviously, again, using the server as a gateway and looking at different servers that you need to manage. But it's the exact same experience, just a little bit more slick, I would say, browser-based, which could also be a benefit. But the whole idea is the same. You have the Windows log section, you have the application log section, and then within, like if I pull up DNS, just as the similar example, it's showing you the informations, the warnings, and the same details over here. Pretty easy, pretty convenient, and I leave it up to you to decide which way you want to use. Last item I want to emphasize here is the server manager that you also have on your servers, and don't scare away with all the red information. It's obviously on purpose to emphasize one of the, I would say, maybe main use cases for using server manager. Apart from installing roles and features, you could actually also use this as some sort of a monitoring/management environment. So here it's going to tell me like, well, there is something wrong with your server. And I mean, it doesn't take a lot of investigation to find out that indeed something is wrong. From here, you could select a service and finding out like what is the actual main problem. In this case, it looks like some Windows module installer. And then you're going to jump to the local server and you're going to look into the events, and that's going to show you a lot more details. Again, severity, warnings, errors, informational, it's all in here. And these are basically, again, pulled in from event viewer, so it's not different information. It's just a different way to look into it. You can see all the running services on the server and then interacting with some tasks. There's a best practice analyzer. Let me move down a little bit. I don't have it configured here. And then what we touched on in other parts of the module, using performance counters. So 3 different ways to manage your servers: event viewer in Windows Admin Center, and then last, using Server Manager. So with that, let's go back to the presentation where I'm going to talk a bit about auditing. Good. We're almost there with our monitoring, but we're not done yet because I also like to emphasize what it takes to run auditing and diagnostics. Now, this is not going to bring in anything really new, just touching on a few other specific scenarios that could be relevant for you to watch over. And that's really that auditing scenario, as well as capturing events in a collection. Now, when we talk about auditing, it really means that apart from getting a view on what's running on the server, you're now also looking into other scenarios. One of the scenarios we're highlighting here is auditing account logon events. So what it means is you would go into Event Viewer, you would open up the Security tab, and then from there filtering like what's happening. What is the reason why a user can or cannot authenticate? Which user account is being used? Or anything else that maybe could also lean into like a cyber attack, where you're going to see that maybe someone is trying to get into a server and having a long list of failed logons. That could mean that it's not just an individual trying to log on to the machine, but actually a process, again, like a cyber attack. Next to that, we used group policies in one of the first modules in the course when we talked about Active Directory and securing, protecting your user accounts. So that's also where in this view, the local security policy is going to open up and showing you a more detailed auditing view on, again, what's happening on the server, but this time looking at it from a policy perspective. I defined group policies. Some machines are picking it up, some other machines are not, and you want to start troubleshooting. So that's one other example here. And that's mainly what I would say we're going to do here with auditing. So another screenshot coming up, where can we find that information? So this is an example where we open up Event Viewer. We talked about it already, so kind of easy. We go into the Security tab, and from there we're going to loop through those messages and again trying to find out what's going on or what's going wrong with the server. You can do auditing on a lot of different levels, and this is where once more the group policy management comes in, where you got more than 60 different configurable policies, which means you're going to enable what we call audit poll. That's like using the group policy auditor characteristics and then using expression-based audit policies, which means you can define what kind of audit logging you want to enable or you don't need. That's really that flexibility that you have. Once you have that auditing and logging enabled, it's going to allow you to get a pretty detailed view. What's happening on my server? What are my server roles? What kind of information is being logged, like user statistic, user activity, user events, technically, as well as device-related data, like somebody plugging in USB sticks, maybe connecting other devices, startup, power up, that kind of scenario. It's all getting logged. And then one other little outsider, but it's still part of monitoring and logging, is can I capture more information during the boot state? Now, depending on a lot of scenarios, you might not have access to the physical startup phase of your server. If it's a virtual machine, depending again a little bit on the characteristics, you might not always see that full boot sequence. So that's where you can enable boot event collection. It's going to allow you to capture as much information as possible from the time your server is starting up, out of a fresh restart, a fresh startup or a restart. And then from there, you could review the logs, again, trying to find out why your server might not even come up and trying to troubleshoot it from that aspect. And you can imagine I got another little demo coming up for this topic, showing you a bit what it takes to enable auditing, how to use it in a basic mode, little bit more advanced but still limited to my demo environment, most probably not reflecting your production environment complexity, and then last showing you how you can enable that boot event collection. When we think about system auditing, I hope it's going to make the reflection that you should try and do this using group policies. So the starting point for me when you enable auditing is going into group policy, going into the Windows settings, security settings, local policies, and defining audit policy options. A lot of different options here, and the default not defined, so you already know how this works from previous modules. And then the other one that we have here is more advanced audit policy configuration, where it's going to allow you to audit logons, the tracking, log-on, log-off actions, changes in policies. So that's, I would say, two prime sources that I would recommend looking into. This is just a definition, right? But then from here, you would switch to Event Viewer. And one of the prime highlights is inside the Windows Logs security section, you have all these detailed audit logs. Now, if I make this a little bit bigger, you can see that we have audit failures, like something or somebody or a process tries to authenticate and it's not working. And then once you select the item, you can see down here what the task category looks like. And then from here, you could actually drill down. And in the details section, you can see that over here, it's in this example, a browser process trying to get privileges. Now, remember that at some point in time, we enabled Smart Screen on our server, and this could be a reflection of that. Or anything else like a user connecting to a website, trying to authenticate a web application, forcing authentication. So that's what you see here. Then it's not always about things going wrong. So you can also do successful audits, where now in this example, it's a logon task. So somebody tried to log on to the server. And we can see that, again, it's part of the security successful audit. And this means that on the domain controller, somebody tried to authenticate, probably myself, to make sure that I could walk you through a demo. And you can see that there's different logon types, like in this case, logon type 3, not restricted, and an account successfully logged on. So that's, I would say, pretty much what we have to emphasize in the auditing. And then last here in this module, we would like to give you some highlights, some tips and tricks, you could say, talking about what if something goes wrong with your Active Directory, where do I start troubleshooting? Again, I need to be a little bit careful here to not give you the misconception that these are the only things that could go wrong with your Active Directory. If there's only a little bit that you know about Active Directory, I think we can all agree that it's a pretty complex service in the platform, and it's also one of the more crucial aspects in your server environment. If Active Directory is not behaving, it means that users could not log on. It means that users' passwords might be out of sync, that identity objects are not getting recognized, devices are no longer recognized, and so much more. So again, I don't want to give you the impression that we cover all possible troubleshooting scenarios, but I would say maybe the most common ones. So we're going to talk about recovering Active Directory objects using the Active Directory recycle bin. A little bit like a restore option, you could say, but it's not the full restore. That's what we do in the other topics. What if we need to recover an Active Directory database? And even worse, can we recover a system state like the sysvol, as we call it? Where the good news is, yes, it's possible, but it's also a little bit tricky to go through that process. And then last, two other scenarios. What about Active Directory replication? If I have more than one, preferably, yes, more than one Active Directory domain server, how can I validate if all those servers are in sync? And obviously also using it when the synchronization is not working as it should be. And then last, what about hybrid authentication? where one scenario we're going to position is the Entra ID hybrid sync, where you run your Active Directory on-prem and you're synchronizing into cloud. So like 5 different scenarios. And again, not pretending these are the only ones that you should look into. The first one that I like to highlight is Active Directory Recycle Bin. Over the years, the scenario, or the problem at least, with Active Directory was that once you made the changes, they were basically gone. And then you had some third-party backup tools allowing you to actually backup your system state, taking a backup of your Active Directory database and allowing you to restore objects from there. We're now, since I think maybe 2008, but I might be wrong there, for quite some years, that's the main message. Active Directory comes with an Active Directory Recycle Bin. Pretty much what you expect from that recycle bin, like even on your Windows platform, you delete the file, you delete the folder, and it's getting moved to recycle bin, allowing you to easily restore, and that's exactly the same here. Any changes in Active Directory, like deleting a user, deleting a group, changing objects or properties on a user or device object, you could now all restore any of that. You go into Active Directory Administrative Center, that's important. It's not available in the Active Directory users and computers. So out of the newer Active Directory Management Interface, you have Recycle Bin available. And from there, you move into the deleted options or deleted items, and you can restore those objects. Now, the main thing here is that you're going to use that recycle bin to maybe restore like fractional objects, like maybe a user. But what if you have more issues going on with your Active Directory? So that's where now you can recover your Active Directory database. What it means is you have a collection of files, like Active Directory has a lot of different files, like there's logging, there's the actual database, there's the system state, the sysvol, and now it allows you to perform recovery operations. One of the cooler ones that I would like to highlight here is a restartable Active Directory domain service. Just like any other service, like a web server, database server, Active Directory is basically nothing more than a running service. So if you need to do some maintenance on the server and you want to stop your Active Directory database or the Active Directory service, you could basically do that. You can start it, you can stop it, you can pause it, and then after the maintenance work is done, you just enable the service and it's back up and running. You could also restore your Active Directory, and that's where the sysvol recovery comes in. A lot of different things, again, can go on and can go wrong in your environment, moving from group policies to having, deleted multiple users, deleting a full organizational unit, and then not relying on the recycle bin to recover. Or your server crashed, your sys volume crashed, and you need to recover. So that's where you have a rebuild recovery process. It's mainly using command line because obviously you don't have a lot of running services at that moment in time, and you're going to go through that process. I don't have a full demo on how to actually recover, but I guarantee you that on our Learn and documentation platform, we have all the details that worst case you might need to look into. Another problem that pops up or might pop up every now and then is your Active Directory domain service replication. So what is that replication aspect? You have your domain controllers. The assumption is, out of the nature of the service, that all domain controllers are by design keeping all other ones in sync. But we also know that every now and then replication might fail. Now I gotta say, in my sort of 20 years background in managing Active Directory and deploying it at customers, and yes, being a consultant and fixing problems, the replication itself actually works really, really well. But it doesn't mean that it's 100% reliable. Why? Because if you have a server that's no longer connected to the network, obviously replication will fail. You might have a problem with not being disconnected, but maybe having latency, where certain changes are not getting replicated. So there's a lot of things that might go wrong in your environment, and that's where you just can touch on different monitoring and troubleshooting aspects. One of them is using Active Directory users and computers. What it means is you're going to open up your console, your management tools, right? And you're going to look into what is my domain controller. And I just created a user account. I don't see it on another domain controller. And then you're going to start troubleshooting. Another view here is the Active Directory sites and services. That's where you can see the different sites like IP, subnet locations, where you're going to open up the connector and you're going to look into the properties and maybe finding out that not all sites are responding. Another way to do this is looking into what we call rep admin. It's the replication Active Directory domain service replication service, where instead of using the graphical Active Directory tools, you're going to use it from a command line perspective. You're going to do rep admin, where you can force the replication, you can show the replication like the common ones, or maybe even forcing a sync across all your servers. And then last, you can go back to Event Viewer. We already talked about it, so no surprise that a lot of that information that's running on the server, including your Active Directory replication service, will also report back into Event Viewer. And when all of this is still going wrong, there's one last exception that I want to highlight, and that's your operations masters. At some point during this course, we talked about the FSMO roles. So that's a technical term for 5 specific roles that each and every domain controller or Active Directory environment should run. Now you can define all those roles on one single server, maybe not the best idea. So what the recommendation looks like is replicating some of those roles across different servers. As we all know, again, every now and then, something might go wrong, which now means that some of your Active Directory management all of a sudden might start looking a little bit different, and you might need to move your FSMO roles from one server to another. So that's where, again, we wanted to highlight, like, apart from everything else we already talked about, also make sure that your 5 FSMO roles are actually running healthy. And again, Event Viewer, troubleshooting, command line options, everything we talked about will help you as well. And then the last scenario here, and then we're almost done with this topic, it's troubleshooting hybrid authentication. When we talk about hybrid authentication, it means we have an Active Directory domain services running on-prem, and we're synchronizing parts of it, maybe all of it, into an Entra ID. The go-to scenario to make all this work is Entra ID Connect. That's a little synchronization tool that you're going to install in your on-prem environment, and it's going to take care of the replication of information like keeping the 2 environments, on-prem and cloud, in sync, and it also comes with some specific troubleshooting options. Once you deploy Entra ID Connect, it's going to obviously watch over the replication of information, and if something goes wrong, it's going to highlight. By the way, you can see the same from the Entra ID portal itself, where you can dive into the Connect Health, and it's going to report like everything's healthy, maybe something is not as healthy as it should be. So you could start the troubleshooting in the on-prem environment. You could also start it from a cloud perspective. And then within Entra ID on the Azure side, you could also look into sign-in logs, finding out why a user can or cannot authenticate for whatever reason. Now, all that to just go back to one of my last demos here, talking a little bit or showing, actually, we already talked about it a lot, showing you what Active Directory domain service recycle bin looks like, showing you what that command line replication monitoring tool looks like, and then last, showing you the Entra ID Connect interface where you can troubleshoot or potentially troubleshoot some of your hybrid replication scenarios. So for this demo, let's zoom in a bit on troubleshooting Active Directory services, where the main goal is showing you a little bit where you could move around in troubleshooting without obviously pinpointing that we can capture all possible issues that you're facing in like a real world scenario. Now the starting point, and I guess this is nothing really new anymore, but the starting point would be Event Viewer. I guess it's the most logical place to go to, where what I talked about before was Windows logs, application logs, and now, since we have Active Directory on this machine, we have a specific section for server role Active Directory. Now, I'm a bit lucky because in my environment, everything seems to be working quite well. I only got informational, so nothing's wrong with my server. And then you also see DNS, where I think Active Directory and DNS are working nicely together. And that's also where you might need to look into some specific, like errors, specific warnings. Another tool that we have is repadmin, as I explained in the presentation. So little console command line tool that you get on a domain controller, where you again have a lot of different options. And then obviously, depending on what kind of problem do you want to read out of it, you're going to use different parameters. So the way to use it is repadmin and some supported flags. So validate the replication, or in this case, like trigger a replication across different domain controllers, which in my demo setup, I don't have. So I cannot really show you any outcomes of this, but you hopefully get the idea. Another option, since we talk about replication, is Active Directory sites and services. This is where you would deploy and define your different sites, like IP ranges, probably domain controllers in branch offices, where you would go into server, you would go into NTDS settings, and then right-click all tasks, check replication topology, where here it's going to run a check, and then you need to refresh every now and then to just make sure that all that information is up to date. All of this is also obviously visible in Event Viewer. Next possible setting, it's not really troubleshooting, but it's two highlights from Active Directory, where I'm using Active Directory Admin Center, like the newer way of managing your environment, where I would like to highlight two capabilities. The first one is the recycle bin. Now, we talked about the recycle bin in another Active Directory specific topic, but the main goal of a recycle bin is obviously when you make changes in your Active Directory objects, like creating users, deleting users, then from there you could run the restore. So you would enable it, and it's going to tell you like, hey, watch out. Once it's enabled, you cannot disable it anymore. So let's go for that. And then it's telling like, oh, I need a little bit of time before this can start working. And then from there, once you have your recycle bin active, you could also do a search for deleted items. Another pretty interesting option is if I go into my users section, and it's not just for users, but I think it's a pretty obvious place to go to. You can make all these changes, and you have this protect from accidental deletion, where we talked about recycle bin, but maybe it's even better to not even have that option to delete, which also means that you don't have to restore. I show you that for the user. You can do the same for group objects. So it's basically for different Active Directory scenarios. Last option I want to touch on in troubleshooting is in the case you have a hybrid scenario, meaning on-prem Active Directory synchronizing to cloud, you would obviously do part of your management out of your Entra ID management interface. So that's what I'm showing you here, where you have a monitoring section, super high level. It's going to show you like what's the activity in your environment. And then you can drill down on the users. And then for each and every user, you can pull up the sign-in information. So depending a bit on the activity, it could be pretty detailed. And then even better, it's also allowing you to look into like conditional access, advanced security, what is the authentication stream, like multi-factor authentication, from what kind of device did the user authenticate. So really detailed, because in a hybrid scenario, you have that interaction between Active Directory and obviously your cloud. And then from here, you could also look into your Entra Connect, and that's that hybrid synchronization tool that you would use. And then from here, you would look into the Connect Sync, which means you're going to run an Active Directory synchronization tool on-prem. And then from here, once you have it, you could also run the troubleshooting in case you see that your replication is not working. And then even more down here, you have health and analytics, specifically analyzing your Connect synchronization tool health. So with that, I think we can wrap up this Active Directory troubleshooting demo and wrapping it up in the presentation. That's it for now. So again, a pretty big module in the totality of our Azure 801, but I would say monitoring troubleshooting is so important. You cannot be a good admin if you don't know how to monitor, and that's why there's so much focus on this topic in the AZ-801 course. I started with monitoring your server environment, initially performance, but then moving to reliability. Talked a little bit about event logs and bringing in some lightweight demos out of my demo environment. Instead of doing that on the spot, troubleshooting, monitoring, we also talked about auditing, about logging, about diagnostics, and then last touching on like 5-6 common scenarios where you might need to troubleshoot if something goes wrong in your Active Directory environment. With that, we're at the end of this module. I got one more to cover. It's still monitoring and troubleshooting as the main concept, but it's now touching on different Azure Monitor troubleshooting capabilities. So with that, as always, thank you for joining me here, but I would like to invite you to join me one last time to our last module, monitoring and troubleshooting in an Azure environment. Thank you for now, and see you again soon.